All right, well, good evening, everybody. We're about a third of the way through after tonight, and so just to recap where we've been, this is going to be a nine session course, and we're working our way, starting at the beginning of the Bible with Genesis, and going all the way through the life of Jesus, and we have a class tonight, we have a class next Wednesday, and then there's a week off where we're going to be celebrating Ash Wednesday. We'll be holding services, so you're welcome to come. But we will not have classes 2 weeks from tonight. So in session 1, we walked our way through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, walking through from creation and walking through the Tower of Babel. Then in week 2, we did the era of the patriarchs. We looked at some of the cities, customs, legal codes of that era. We looked at the remnants of what we believe is Sodom. We looked at the story of Joseph, one of the patriarchs who was sold off into slavery into Egypt. And so tonight, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, which is Joseph has welcomed his family into Egypt in this city called Ramses, which in the ancient world was known as Avaris. And so as I like to do, let's start with a quote. It's probably help if I turn this on. All right, it's giving me grief already. You're welcome, Mark. We'll be fine alone. All right, so going back, here we go. So archaeology, this is an archaeologist who was at Wheaton College. He says, archaeology has confirmed countless passages which have been rejected by critics as unhistorical or contradictory to known facts. Archaeological discoveries have shown that these critical charges are wrong and that the Bible is trustworthy. We do not know of any cases where the Bible has been proven wrong. And so if you go by his estimation, you can look back at the totality of the scriptures that start, way back at creation, but then you find Abraham in Genesis, 400 years. Remember this pattern? Abraham in 2000, the patriarchs, 400 years of slavery, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight as this era. Then Moses comes and delivers them. Then 400 years of judges, then they demand a king, and you have 400 years of divided kingdom. Then they rebuild the temple, and they return from exile, and then you have 400 years of prophetic silence after the book of Malachi, and then you get the life of Jesus. So that's what the Bible says we should have historically. That's what people who believe that the archaeological record supports the scriptures would say is there. But then you have people like this guy, Dr. Zev Herzog, who's from Tel Aviv University, who said this in the 90s. The Israelites were never were in Egypt. The whole chain is not a historical one. It is a later legendary reconstruction of a history that never happened. So they will teach you this in colleges and some seminaries. And so tonight we're going to ask the question, because what he says is a very popular opinion, that all of a sudden when you got to the exile, when the Babylonians took the Israelites into exile, that they were like, we have to create a story to give ourselves a history. And they made everything before that moment up. So the period of the kings, the periods of Moses, Joshua, judges, patriarchs, all of that was made up whole cloth to give Israel an identity. And so tonight we're going to be looking at that. Last week we talked about how Joseph is sold by his brothers. At the end of Genesis, it tells you that Joseph gave his brothers the best property of Egypt, the best clothing in Egypt in the land of Ramses. And we talked about how when you go to Egypt and you go to ancient Ramses and you dig under it, there's an ancient city that is called Avaris. And when you dug around in Avaris, you came across really, really amazing stuff. We believe we have found the palace of Joseph. This obsession with the number 12, the 12 tombs, with one of them being royal. And he is depicted as someone who comes from Syro-Palestine. He's got a ring that describes his job, which is an overseer of foreign trade. Everything in Egypt changes during his lifetime. And so we pick up where we left off. And here's the opening question. Okay, so we close the book of Genesis with Joseph and his brothers coming down there. We open the book of Exodus and like 400 years have passed. And so how does the Bible describe the circumstances surrounding the enslavement of the Hebrews? Because it's one chapter and 400 years are kind of encapsulated in this one chapter at the opening of Exodus. So let's look at what happens. We're told that the descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all, and that Joseph was already in Egypt. So at the beginning of the 400-year period, you've got 400 years to go from 70 people in all to where at the time that they leave Egypt, 430 years later, 600,000 men leave on foot, not including women and children. And so you ask yourself the question, how in the world can you go from 70 people to what they estimate would be 2 million in that period of time? And it works like this. It's exponential growth. If you doubled your population every generation, which in an ancient agrarian slave culture is not asking a lot, but if you just doubled your population every generation, you would have way surpassed the 2 million mark within 400 years. And you think, okay, well, to double the population, that means 2 people, man, woman, would have to have 4 kids. And then they would have to double again and double again. And you think, man, that's really hard. Do you know what the birth rate, what the average woman during the founding of America, do you know how many kids they had? 8. Somebody guessed it. Very good. All right, way to go, Chip. You win nothing. All right. So this is just asking for 4. At the founding of America, they had a higher birth rate than this. So the population began to explode, and that's another one of the factors. It said, now Joseph and all of his brothers and all of that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and it multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous. In other words, that command in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply, they were doing it. And so the land, it says, was filled with them. Well, let's go back and look at the numbers. How long would that take before you would say the land was filled with them? Well, I wouldn't say here, that's not filled with them. But man, you start getting over on this side, and man, that's a lot of Israelites all of a sudden that are just populating and reproducing, and you'd say the land was filled with them. And so then this is the description of how everything comes about. Then a new king. These are important clues that we're going to be talking about tonight. So hang on to this lingo. A new king who did not know about Joseph. So something happened, some change happened to where the new Pharaoh does not have a mental connection, a relational connection with anything about Joseph. And that king came to power in Egypt, and he said, look, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. So when is this happening in the timeline? They had to have a couple hundred years more before the Israelites grow in number to where they're like, man, these people are a threat now. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. They're worried about a massive number. And so what do? They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built, just gives us 2 cities, Pithom and Ramses, which will be Avaris, as store cities for Pharaoh. And so the question then is, okay, we're told that they're enslaved, but what's happening during this 400-year period where they're in Egypt, right? They're not yet enduring bitter slavery. This new king who didn't remember Joseph hasn't come along. And it's good to know the history of what's going on in Egypt during the quiet years. And so I'm going to walk you through it. Hang with me because it will help make sense of some of the patterns that come. So the Bible declares that all the countries, at the end of Genesis, all of the countries during the 7-year famine are coming to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. Well, this picture that you see up here was taken at a tomb in Beni Hassan in Egypt, and it's referring, if you see up here, this is talking about Hyksos. And Hyksos was an Egyptian word that means foreign rulers. They came from other lands, and they were all bringing, you can see them bringing their children, and they're bringing their goods, and they're bringing their grain, and they're bringing animals to trade for food because famine has decimated the world. And here come all these rulers of foreign lands. Well, if rulers of foreign lands, which is what Hyksos means, they're coming into Egypt, they're bringing their populations, their lands are devastated, and all of a sudden, things begin to change in Egypt. This is Egyptian for the Hyksos, and you can see the crown along with the shepherd's staff. This is what it means, foreign rulers, and they were a shepherd class. And you look at any history, and they will say that right about this time, so Joseph comes to rise in 1870 BC, all this influx of people come in, and it says the rise of Hyksos kings in Egypt was made possible by an influx of immigrants from Palestine, that's Israel and Syria and that region, into Egypt. And modern scholarship has identified most of the Hyksos kings' names as Semitic. The Hyksos are not the Israelites. We'll see that in a minute. But they're all the people from regions where the famine is just crushing people, and they flood into Egypt. And this is going to become important. So around 1900 BC, when all this influx is happening, you get this guy Nefertiti, which we've mentioned before, who's complaining at this massive immigration. And he says, all happiness has gone away. This is a native Egyptian in the Nile Delta. The land is cast down in trouble because of these feeders. They're coming to take all our food. Asiatics, the people from Asia, the Near East, right? Who are throughout the land. Enemies have arisen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt, and that is going to have really, really massive consequences for the timeline of Egypt. So here's where we're at, right? Here you have 1870. This is when we believe that Joseph comes into Egypt. He rises up to the right hand of Pharaoh and says, I've got plenty of food. We have stored up 7 years of plenty to save the world during this famine. And sure enough, massive numbers of people come into Egypt, and they settle in the towns where Joseph and his family were living. You have this massive migration, and then northern Egypt goes into decline, and every Egyptologist on the face of the planet will agree that Egypt went from being unified, where you had northern Egypt, which is called Lower Egypt, and southern Egypt, which is called Upper Egypt. Usually they're combined. But all of a sudden, the Hyksos, these foreign rulers come in, and they topple the Egyptians in the northern part of Egypt. So people from Palestine reign in Egypt. They take all the titles. They say, we're pharaohs. They embrace the Egyptian gods. And so and a lot of times, back in 20, 30 years ago, we knew that the Hyksos rose up in Egypt, but we believe that they invaded and took over northern Egypt. But now we know that's not true. They dwelled there for centuries ahead of this, and we know that from looking at DNA. So a team of archaeologists from the United Kingdom, Austria, and France collected enamel samples from the teeth, this is just weird stuff. The science is so wild. From the teeth of 75 human skeletons that are almost 4,000 years old that are buried at Tel El Daba, which is Avaris. And the Hyksos capital, they found that the Hyksos did not come as foreign invaders, but they actually migrated to Egypt, and they lived there for generations before they seized power. And they can tell because of what's in the enamel. They were much like the natives. And so this is what a map of Egypt would have looked like. In the north, you have the Hyksos that took over this whole region. These are natives from Palestine. The Israelites, right? Joseph and his family. This is where they are, up in Goshen. But the Hyksos, all of these people who came to buy grain from Joseph, take this over. Then you had Egypt. And then down beneath them, you had Cush, which is like the Ethiopians, the Nubians, the very, very dark-skinned. And so Egypt is sandwiched in between them. So you have this Hyksos Pharaoh. This is how one of the reasons why we know the Hyksos are not the Israelites. Don't make the mistake of thinking that they are, because they worship the Egyptian gods. They took, like, for example, Epiwar, who is one of their kings, worships Set. So he's not with them. So then what happens? And this is where we're going when I talk to you about a new king and everything revolutionizing and changing. When all the conditions in Egypt got really bad for the Israelites, this is what happens, I believe. Here's my theory. You have a Pharaoh whose name is Kamos, right? And he comes along and he's a good bit after Joseph. And you can see when he reigns right here. And so he is just tired of these foreign rulers dwelling in northern Egypt and using all their resources. And so Kamos writes, and we have his stele over here where he writes all this stuff. He says, one chief is in Avaris. Another is in Cush, so one to the north of me, one to the south of me, and I sit here associated with an Asiatic and a Nubian that are controlling territories that Egypt should control. Each man has his slice in this Egypt, and so the land is partitioned with me. No one can be at ease when they are milked by the taxes of the Asiatics, who have all the places where you raise cattle and where you grow food. I shall grapple with him that I may crush his belly, for my desire is to rescue Egypt, which the Asiatics, the foreigners, have destroyed. And so what does he do? Well, he decides to go to his council. And you notice this is when he reigns. Notice the population of the Israelites. We're getting up to where now their number is a threat. You would look at that number and go, man, they're pretty numerous. We got to worry about them. Like if it's over here, who cares? Egypt would crush that. Their numbers have grown. We got to be fearful of them. And so what happens? His advisors come to Kamos and they say, don't go to war. Do not go to war with these Hyksos people. Their free land is cultivated for us. Our cattle are grazing in the delta while corn is being sent to our pigs. Our cattle have not been seized. They haven't done anything. He has the land of the Asiatics. We have Egypt. We still have Thebes. Only when it comes to one who attacks should we attack him. We're not going to go to war. Don't go to war with the Hyksos unless they attack us first. And Kamos is like, I hate them. We're going to war because otherwise they will never respect me. And Kamos goes to war to overthrow the Hyksos, and he fails. But then comes another guy. And it's his brother. By the way, when it says, just an interesting little side note, you notice where it says, our cattle graze in the delta? So here you have Kamos, one of these ancient pharaohs, who's writing about how all of his cattle graze in the delta, and you're thinking, well, that's dumb. Why in the world would you have all of your cattle grazing in properties that are owned by somebody else? That was common back in Egypt. You know how else we know that? Because in the Bible, when Pharaoh is talking with Joseph, listen to what he says. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my livestock. And so going back all the ways to Joseph, you have the Pharaoh saying, hey, you're going to be up in the Nile Delta. I want you taking care of my livestock, even though I live way down in Thebes. This was the pattern. It was normal. And so we find that not only in the archaeological record, but beyond that. And so according to Kamos, the Hyksos, he tries to tell everybody, the Hyksos are planning against us. They're conspiring with the Nubians in the south, and they want the Nubians to come up and attack us while we're guarding and advancing into the north. And so he said, he gets communications that say, come north. See, this is from the Hyksos down to the Cushites. Come north. See, Kamos is coming up here to make war with us Hyksos. There's no one who will stand up to you in Egypt if you just invade. I will not give him a way out. I'll keep him busy. I'll keep him fighting. And you, Cush, can come up from the south and conquer everything, and then we'll split it. But Cush says, no thanks. And so the Hyksos are left to fight Egypt alone. And an enraged Kamos writes in his stele, the mistresses of Avaris shall not conceive once the war whoop of my troops is heard. And he goes up there determined that no more children are going to be born to these foreigners. And he fails. But he's got a brother that's going to finish the job. So is there evidence of a new king who did not know Joseph enslaving people in the region of Avaris? Here we go. This is where it gets good. All right, here we go. So after the death of Kamose I, his brother Amos I launches the 19th dynasty. There's major periods in Egyptian history. Do you know what this period is called? The New Kingdom period. Why? Because it's all new. They haven't reigned over the northern part of Egypt for a while. It's all new. The way that they reign is going to change. And so a new king comes to reign over Egypt. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And then a new king, Amos, comes and conquers the Hyksos, and a new king who did not know about Joseph emerges in power over that region of Egypt. And so this is Amos. He's a looker, all right? But he's a pharaoh who dwelled and lived a little bit more than a century ahead of where we should find the Exodus. And so we have communications between him and some of his soldiers. This is another one of his soldiers who's also named Amos. They were super creative. Son of Ibana, and he records his exploits. And listen to what he says. So he goes through the towns like Avaris, where the Israelites would have been. And he says, when the town of Avaris was besieged, this is Joseph's home. This is where the Israelites primarily settle. When the town of Avaris was besieged, I fought bravely. And what did Pharaoh do? My captives were given to me as slaves. After another victory over Atta, Pharaoh Amos gave all his people as booty. And so when the north falls, all of the people that are in that region are reduced to intense slavery. If they weren't already slaves, now they're captives and slaves, which heightens the level of intensity and cruelty. So this is from Exodus. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. That's Amos to the left. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. And so here's another clue, right? They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. When you learned about this in ancient history or in Bible stories, what are the Hebrew slaves building? Yeah, they're building the pyramids, or they're building statues of Pharaoh. Like every cartoon, every movie, it has them doing that. Read it closely. What are they doing? They're building store cities. What in the world is that? They would build entire storage cities that are just filled. The whole point of them is to be filled with grain silos, to build tunnels underneath streets, and you would just pack it full of grain. That was the whole point of this city, was to make sure that when famine hit, this city is the salvation, right? And so building storage cities is what they're going to be doing. So you go to papyrus from this particular time period, late Middle Kingdom, beginning of the New Kingdom, and you find papyruses that are records. This is actually being housed. You can see it's being housed in the Brooklyn Museum. You see on this page of the copy of all these papyrus. And all of these names that are recorded there, a massive number of them are Semitic. So people say, oh my goodness, you never had Israelite slaves. You never had slaves from the region in Egypt. No. Here you have records where 48 of the 77 names included on this receipt are Semitic names. Very likely Hebrew slaves. You go to the city when you're digging down in Avaris and you get to this particular level where Amos comes to power, and you know what you find? The city transformed from being the capital, which was like the Hyksos greatness. This is where Joseph built his palace. Everything about it is regal. And all of a sudden, at this particular time period, you know what the city does? It transforms into a slave city. And you go throughout, and it turns into a storage city. And so one of the reports that was published on this by a guy named Manfred Bietek, who's a professor at the University of Vienna, he says, listen, a residential quarter with several buildings, and they haven't even excavated all of Tel El Daba, which is Avaris. A residential quarter with several buildings with attached courtyards and granaries separated by streets was unearthed in the uppermost layer, which can be dated to the very end of the Second Intermediate Period, which means the beginning of the New Kingdom period, almost. Many of the city's buildings featured small brick-lined storage caves under the floor. So what do you mean? This city is so obsessed with storage that there's storage caves underneath the floors. There's storage caves in the streets. You go out and you look what they've done. These are the drawings that are done by this archaeologist, who, by the way, is not a Christian. And you know what he finds when he starts excavating the city? You see all these little circles? You know what they are? Granary silos. This is a storage city, plain as day. And so BTAC writes that this was a massive storage compound. He says it's built like the ruins are removed atop the ruins of a Hyksos settlement, and they discovered at least 30 round grain silos that had been built on the ruins of the Hyksos that had been conquered, with many others on the south side of the city. And so BTAC adds this amenity was used to store how much? Enormous quantities of grain, almost like it's maybe a store city. Maybe this is a storage city. Enormous quantities of grain and probably other foodstuff for a considerable number of people. It could have been a makeshift military facility for supplying troops. Well, you look at a map of Egypt. Here's the Nile Delta. You go way to the northeast of it, and that's where you're going to find Avaris. And so on any of their missions where they go up into Palestine to make war against the Hittites or whoever, this is their last supply line. It makes total sense why Pharaoh would want this to be a store city, why he would want all of Goshen to be filled with storage cities to supply his armies that are going up into the Palestine area. And so you look, this is a reconstruction of what they did as archaeologists, and here is where you see the royal quarters of where Joseph used to live, where the Hyksos palace and everything like that were. And then outside of it, everything all of a sudden becomes slave quarters. Really cheaply made. Really, really poor people dwelled all throughout this whole stretch, this massive city of slaves that surrounds this old quarter. And by the way, you see slave settlements all over the place. These little yellow dots are settlements that have been proven to be ancient slave quarters all throughout the region of Goshen, which is where the Israelites would have been enslaved. It's fascinating. Does anybody have any questions so far? Yes, Jim.
This is going back a little, but if Herzog believes that the Jews did not come from Israel, where does he say their origins were?
That's one of the great questions. His question was, if the Israelites didn't come out of Egypt, if they didn't conquer the promised land, then why all of a sudden, and when you get to the period of Judges, so that we're going to talk about two sessions from now, they don't have an answer for that. But all of a sudden, right at the time of the conquest, Israelite cities are just, they're everywhere. And it's like, okay, well, if they didn't come from somewhere, what in the world is all this record for? Like, it makes no sense. And I don't even know that he would still hang on to that. Yeah. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Yes.
Well, I don't know if anybody else noticed this. It's kind of, they always tell you never know your history. Because you can repeat it again. If you look at the Samaria then, now what's happening,
what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So when you look around these Israelite settlements, all of their weapons are Syrian. They're Israeli. They're from that region, right? They're not Egyptian. This is one of my favorites. The people who are buried like that. Most Egyptians are buried with their back. If they're noble, they cross their arms. But this guy is a Hebrew. And why is he buried like that? What does he look like he's doing? He's in a fetal position. He looks like he's sleeping. Why did they bury their dead like they were sleeping? Maybe because they expected them to wake up, to rise up, or to be born again. It's really wonderful. And we know from the previous week that they buried animals close to their houses, which the Egyptians would never do. So these are clearly foreign slaves. So this comes from Patterns of Evidence, which was a series that was produced on Netflix, really fascinating about some of the stuff in Egypt. And he said the children's graves that are all over the place, when you go to this particular time period and you look at the age, the estimated age of the different burials of children, all of a sudden, at this particular time period, the children under 1, 50%. Now, you had early mortality back then, so it would be higher than it is today by a long shot. But that's off the charts versus the norm. Why in the world would they find all of these places where babies are dead? Remember early Exodus. What are they doing? Midwives, take the babies that are born and do what with them? Kill them. Soldiers, take the babies that are born and throw them into the Nile. So there was like, kill these children. And one of the other things that you should expect to find, who were they killing? They were killing baby boys. And so the proportion of the graves for the adults all of a sudden goes whoosh, way more women that are reaching adulthood. You follow? Why would that be? Because the baby boys were being slaughtered. Really fascinating how all that works. So does the story of Moses fit into the historical details of Egypt's 18th dynasty? And so this is a part where I'm kind of arguing from just looking at what's going on in Egypt, because it so fits like a glove of what we know about the scriptures. But you got to hang with me. We're going to get into some family tree stuff. You with me? Oh, that wasn't very enthusiastic. We're going to get into some family tree stuff. Who's excited? All right. So we need to know when Moses is born. So the Bible gives us some clues. We are told in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, that Solomon builds the temple 480 years after the Exodus. Okay, well, we know that Solomon built the temple in 966 BC. So we rewind and go back in history 480 years, and we land at 1446. That's when we should expect to find the Exodus. And we know that Moses was how old when he crossed the Red Sea? 80. So, okay, if he did 1446, he's 80 years old. You back up another year, 80 years, and you should find Moses' birthday at 1526 BC. Okay, well, what's going on in Egypt at 1526 BC? We can look over here and see here's the record of pharaohs. And right during that time period, we should expect to find a guy whose name is Thutmose I. He reigns from 1530 to 1517 BC. Is there anything cool about him? Well, we know that in 1526, Moses is supposedly found by Pharaoh's daughter in the Nile River. Records suggest that the Pharaoh at the time was named Thutmose I, and he had a queen named Queen Ahmose. Remember her name, that'll be important later. And they had one child. And her name was Hatshepsut, which is a fun name to say. You can get yourself in trouble with that name. Hatshepsut. All right. When the child grew older, he became her son. So she adopts Moses into her family. He becomes a prince of Egypt. Okay, so then what happens to Thutmose I? Where does this family tree go? Well, first off, I want you to look at this dynasty, because when you get to the 18th and 19th dynasty, they're obsessed with a particular name. Thutmose I, Ahmose I, the brother of Kamose, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Thutmose IV. Even when you get to the 19th dynasty, you've probably heard of Ramses, but guess what that is? Ra-Moses. Or you may have heard Thutmose, that's Thutmosis, and it comes from born out of. Moses' name means drawn from the water, born out of it, right? That's what Moses means. And so in this dynasty, and in the next one to come, you've got this obsession with the name Moses all over the place. That kind of fits. Really fascinating. And so here's the checklist. When you come to the scriptures, if you got any skeptics in here, you're my kindred spirits, right? So I look at the scriptures and I say, man, it's really hard to believe this story. And I'll give you some reasons why you should be skeptical that this story could be true. Ready? Neither Thebes nor Memphis, which are the main capital cities of Egypt, are anywhere near Avaris. They're way to the south. And so how in the world is Moses waking up during the Exodus story and going and visiting Pharaoh? Thebes and Memphis are many, many days away. Why in the world is Pharaoh's daughter bathing in a slave city in the Nile? Why is she there? Moses, a prince, and Pharaoh, who's considered a god, are going to live in a slave city? A city that's devoted to the storage of grain? Yeah, right. Moses flees from Pharaoh. And by the way, you remember when Moses kills the Egyptian, he runs away in fear for his life because Pharaoh wants to kill him. And we're told this, that he goes and he serves as a shepherd for 40 years. And at the end of that 40 years, he gets word from God, you can go back now. Why? Because that Pharaoh who wanted to kill you 40 years ago is now dead. So you should expect to find a Pharaoh who reigns that long. That's pretty hard to believe, right? Like, especially back then. Moses visits the Pharaoh regularly. It's like he's next door neighbors with him. He goes there 12 times. He travels to Pharaoh's palace in minutes. It says he woke up and went to Pharaoh's palace, and he's there in that morning. Pharaoh's palace has a temple and a court of magicians and a slave city. He has a palace? Come on, he's got jesters and magicians who are doing crazy things when Moses shows up. He has access to great multitudes of chariots. Remember when Moses runs away? Pharaoh's like, let's go. And there's suddenly hundreds of chariots there. Really? Slave population suddenly vanishes. Are you going to find that? Hint, hint. It's cool stuff. So Thutmose reigns in 1530 at the time of Moses' birth. But then you ask yourself, why is Pharaoh's daughter at Avaris at the time of Moses' birth? So they are digging at Avaris. And this is what they find. A royal structure that's built shortly after the fall of the Hyksos kingdom. And the team's report claims that it dates, get this, to the beginning of the 18th dynasty after the fall of Avaris, after circa 1530 BC. When is Moses born? 1526, 4 years after they estimate this new palace is built for Thutmose I and presumably his family, which would include Hatshepsut, his daughter, Moses is born. Gee, there just so happens to be an Egyptian palace that's brand new right there. And that's the palace. Pretty cool. Thutmose I, you know what it looks like? Right there. That's the architect's rendering of what it would have looked like. Gee, where is it positioned? Oh, it's right on the Nile. It would make sense that his daughter wakes up and leaves the palace and goes down and bathes in the Nile. Now all of a sudden that makes sense. Okay, well that's cool. That comes together. Well, Thutmose I is our Pharaoh, and he marries Queen Ahmose, and Hatshepsut comes down. They can't have a son, but Thutmose I is like, I really have to have a son to pass the throne to. And so he takes a second wife, and they have a son named Thutmose II. Ahmose wants something of this royal lineage, so they take her daughter and they marry her to her half-brother Thutmose II. It's pretty common back in the day, right? Everybody with me? We're hanging on the family tree because it gets weird. So then, okay, Thutmose I dies. Thutmose II then becomes Pharaoh. He's married to Hatshepsut. They can't have sons, so he takes a second wife, and they have Thutmose III. She's now older. He's an infant, and this guy dies. Here's the problem. Who becomes Pharaoh? You can't give it to Thutmose III. He's just a little one. You know who becomes Pharaoh? Hatshepsut. Say it with me. Hatshepsut. Oh, that was weak. Hatshepsut. How many of you are saying bad words? It's a tricky one. So anyway, you have Hatshepsut that now becomes the Pharaoh. She takes on all the markings of a pharaoh. She puts on the regal regalia. She wears the snake. She's got the crown. She takes on all the titles of the gods. She's full-blown pharaoh, and she's a pretty awesome pharaoh, by the way. She's an awesome pharaoh, very powerful. And so when Thutmose II dies, Thutmose III's too little. Stepmom comes along and says, oh, I'll take the power, and you go away into military school. I'll watch the throne for you. Not a good call, we'll find out later. And by the way, so if Moses comes along because she is unable to have children, remember, when Moses comes along, it makes sense that she would be like, a child, I want to keep it. And then Moses becomes a prince that now is in direct competition with Thutmose III. So what do we know about Hatshepsut's reign? We know that she's pretty obsessed with the town of Avaris, her childhood home, her northern getaway, right? And so on the Spios Adormitos inscription, she writes, I have restored that which had been ruined. I've raised up that which had gone to pieces formerly, since the Asiatics were in the midst of Avaris of the Northland, and the vagabonds, those Hyksos, were in the midst of them. What is she saying? Avaris was destroyed in war. It was destroyed by the vagabonds, but I so love Avaris. There's something in me that has such a connection with Avaris that she takes the treasury of Egypt and she rebuilds Avaris. Why does she have such affinity for this place? Well, we know that she consolidated power. Look at this. She took all the honorary titles, wore the regalia of the male pharaoh, even attached a beard to herself. Misogynist. She sent Thutmose III into the military where he grew skilled and popular. That was her mistake. Hatshepsut desired peace and economic prosperity. She grew the empire, tremendously wealthy, very prosperous pharaoh. Meanwhile, Thutmose III, who was in military school and was commanding the loyalty of the army, wanted military expansion. Let's take Egypt and grow it. And so in 1483, Hatshepsut dies, and Thutmose III takes full control over Egypt. So let me ask you a question. How old is Moses when he runs away from Egypt fearing for his life? No. He's 80 when he crosses the Red Sea. He's 40 when he runs away. So 1526, fast forward 40 years, and you get 1486, right at about the time she dies. 3 years after she dies, there's a new Pharaoh in town. And Moses is vulnerable. And guess who I'm sure Thutmose III would love to snuff out of existence? The competitor to the throne. And so right at this time, Moses kills an Egyptian. He's thinking, I'm going to stage a revolt. I'm going to liberate my people. Now's my chance. It tells us that. And nobody joins him. And he knows this Pharaoh will kill him. This isn't dear old brother that you find in the Prince of Egypt. No. And he runs for his life. And these are the mummified remains of Hatshepsut, also a looker. So we find, and we know that's her. We know that Thutmose III took her. She had built a royal tomb for herself. But Thutmose III so hated his mother for stealing the throne that he actually did not bury her in her tomb, but put her in a servant's place. And the only reason why we know that that's Hatshepsut is DNA testing. I don't know who's running around testing all these mummies, but somebody's doing it. And so they found that she is the daughter of Queen Ahmose. This is her. And so later tests revealed she had diabetes, arthritis, and bone cancer. And they think that she was extremely fat because you can see the skin kind of sags on her mouth. It's like, can you give the poor woman a break? Like, do we have to put that in the histories? But later tests reveal that she has diabetes, arthritis, bone cancers, and they believe that she died in her late 50s in 1483, which would mean at the time that we expect her to give birth to Moses, she's right in her mid-teens, the age of women becoming mothers in the ancient world. It just lines up perfectly. And so Thutmose, her competitor, stepson, hates her and goes on campaigns all throughout Egypt, finding statues of Hatshepsut and smashing her head. And in Egypt, they believed that your spirit lived on through your images, and so they wanted to smash it all, to take away not just her life and her legacy, but her everlasting, her spirit life, right? Smashing the head, taking off the regal thing, smashing her crown. And you can see here, this is a wall where she was engraved in it. They took picks and actually picked away at her image from the wall to try to remove her memory from the histories of Egypt. He went to great lengths to do that. And so let's walk through the timeline again. In 1526, Moses is born. The Pharaoh is Thutmose I. In 1486, Moses says, oh my goodness, my mom is dead. I'm vulnerable. I'm out of here. 1486. So then the time of the Exodus is going to be 1446 when he turns 80, 40 years later. So let's fast forward, and what do we find? What do we know about these two pharaohs? What do we know about Thutmose I, which is the pharaoh that he ran away from? And what do we know about the successor to the throne, Amenhotep II, who is the one that Moses will come back and confront? Really interesting here. So Thutmose III is one of the most famous pharaohs in the history of Egypt. He's nicknamed the Napoleon of Egypt because he just goes and conquers everything. You remember how Moses goes for 40 years and eventually God comes to him after 40 years and says, hey, the Pharaoh that sought to kill you is dead now. You know how long this Pharaoh reigned? 54 years. Plenty of time to swallow up that 40-year period. Fits perfectly. So he leads Egypt to the pinnacle of its power. He's the Napoleon of Egypt, 17 successful military campaigns to where he goes up here, conquers Palestine, conquers into Syria, into Assyria, even into some of the Hittite lands. And it says he made all the land his vassals. So they're under his control. They're all paying taxes to him. And he's likely the Pharaoh who forced Moses to flee. And the Pharaoh had an obvious motive to kill Moses, who's a competitor. There he is. Get his tender account. Sorry, that was way out of line. So Thutmose III is the longest reigning pharaoh of the entire 18th dynasty. That's significant because it covers those 40 years. Meanwhile, Thutmose III reigned over Egypt for another 37 years after Moses fled, if our dates are right. Exodus states during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Lord comes to Moses and says, go back, for all the men who wanted to kill you are dead. So he doesn't go back and say, hey, Amenhotep, remember me? Like, no, they're all, the previous generation's dead. So what do we know about Thutmose III? He's kind of strange for an Egyptian pharaoh because they weren't known for having really bitter, harsh slavery. But this guy suddenly becomes a very bitter, harsh tyrant. And his wall paintings, this is from Rekhmire, who's the vizier, the second highest guy under his command. And it makes a point, like these are all the slaves. And one of the things that's interesting is Egyptians and Nubians have dark hair, dark skin, but you see mixed in there people with lighter colored hair, lighter colored skin. These are Semitic people. And what are they doing? They're making bricks. Remember the Exodus story? What are they doing? They're making bricks, and they have to go get their own straw, and they're creating granaries, and they're doing all that stuff. And so here you see the Egyptian guard, and the hieroglyph that's above his head, if it was there, says, the rod is in my hand, do not be idle. In other words, this slavery is not nice. This is a bitter, brutal, cruel slavery under Thutmose III. Quotas for bricks. I took this picture when we were over in Egypt and we were around one of the pyramids, and you find these things. It's just fascinating to pick up a brick and to know, by the way, it had already fallen off. I'm not destroying things. But to look at it and you see, like you can see out of this brick is hanging all this straw. You know, this was a big conversation between Moses and Pharaoh. You're keeping them from building bricks. I'm going to punish them by making them go get their own straw. You see in the next dynasty, this is under Ramses II. This is in the Louvre Museum. And he says the people failed to meet their brick-making quota. And it says, according to this leather scroll, this papyrus that's behind the text you can see, the shortfall occurred because the slaves could not gather the required amount of straw. This was a problem in the ancient world. It sounds very familiar to the biblical story. Making bricks and having to go out and get their own straw, like it records it. Now this, another one. You're welcome for all these images, by the way. This is the son of Thutmose III. So if Moses runs away from Thutmose III, he's going to return to confront this guy, Amenhotep II. He reigns from 1452 to 1417, so the time of the Exodus, 1446, is right there. He reigns over Egypt immediately following his dad. Many scholars believe he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But here's what's interesting. He is not a firstborn son. Why is that important? Well, the 10th plague, remember what should happen to the firstborn? He died. Well, it just so happens he is not a firstborn son. The firstborn son of Thutmose III was a guy named Prince Amenemhat. He was the firstborn son, but he predeceased his father, interestingly. And so this opened the door to Amenhotep II. And this guy, you should expect, remember, his heart grew hard. He was super stubborn. He's super proud. This guy is like the Korean dictator of ancient Egypt. He's got such an inflated view of himself. And here's some examples. In the Memphis Stela, he's leading a military campaign into the Levant, which is like Israel and Syria and that region. And this is how he describes it. Amenhotep boasted that there was no one with his majesty except himself with his valiant and mighty arm. And his majesty killed them by shooting arrows. And so he goes up against entire foreign nations, and he doesn't need an army. He's that good. He scored an 18 in golf, right? Like, he's a megalomaniac. He claimed that his arrows could penetrate metal plates and that he could row a ship faster and farther than 200 Egyptian soldiers in their navy. Like, this is his record. This guy is a megalomaniacal tyrant of the exact kind of character you should expect to find in the biblical Pharaoh, who is hard-hearted. So his son comes along, and guess what? He's not a firstborn son either. That's really important, because what happens to his firstborn son? He should die, right? And so his son, who is not a firstborn, is a guy by the name of Thutmose IV. He's regarded as the Pharaoh after Amenhotep II. He's not the firstborn. And if you go to the Sphinx, you can see there's this a stele that's between the paws of the Sphinx at Giza. And this explains, I wasn't the firstborn son, but the gods promised me that I would be made Pharaoh if I restored the great Sphinx. So I restored the great Sphinx, and that's why I get to be Pharaoh. Not because it's my birthright. I'm not a firstborn son. So all of this fits together. This, by the way, is probably the firstborn son of Amenhotep II. The Pharaoh of the Exodus, here's his firstborn son. He's the only son that is buried with Amenhotep II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He's buried in his tomb with him. And so in 1898, Victor Leray, who's the head of Egypt's Antiquity Service, goes into Amenhotep II's tomb, and inside it he finds Prince Webensenu, aged 10, perhaps the firstborn son of Amenhotep II. He's the only one buried. So his firstborn son dies at 10. You look at timelines and where you should expect to find things, this measures up so well. It's really tragic. It's haunting to look at this and think, that's real. That 10th plague is right before your eyes. Is there any historical evidence of the 10 plagues on Egypt? Well, there is. Probably one of my favorites is on display at the Leiden Museum, and it's called the Epiwar Papyrus, and it goes on for quite a while. They've dated it to the 19th Dynasty, which is the dynasty right after the Exodus. And it was written about some kind of cataclysmic event that overtakes Egypt and throws the whole nation of Egypt into some really, really hard times. And I just want to share with you some excerpts. You can see, even in the museum, what does it say? The Papyrus Epiwar, Leiden 344, an Egyptian parallel to the biblical 10 plagues. It's impossible not to see when you read it. It's dated like 100 plus years right after Moses, but more than 3,000 years ago. It's recording something. Let's look at it. Indeed, poor men have become owners of wealth. Who would that be? Well, slaves are pretty poor. They plunder Egypt. They leave with gold and silver and all the precious clothing. So poor men have become owners of wealth. And he who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of riches. Indeed, pestilence is through the land. You remember the plagues? Pestilence is through the land. Blood is everywhere. Death is not lacking. The mummy cloth speaks even before one comes near it. Indeed, many dead are buried in the river. Why would it say that? What would they do with the newborn babies? The army was commanded to do what? Throw them in the river. So during this time period, there was a habit of throwing the dead into the river to die. corpses in the river. So moving on from that, many dead are buried in the river. The stream is a sepulcher, a grave, a place of embalmment has become a stream. Goes on, get this one. Indeed, the river is blood. What's the very first plague? The Nile River turns to blood. What does he mean? What is Epiwar getting at? The river is blood, yet men drink from it. Indeed, everywhere the barley has perished. Can you think of plagues like... So it's not saying it's a famine, by the way, because the barley sprouted and perished. So we had a bumper crop, there was the barley, and then all of a sudden, locusts, maybe, took it out. Maybe hail came down and all the barley now is beaten and devastated and it's all perished. The storehouse is empty. The keeper stretched on the ground. Behold, this is wild. Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water. What in the world does that mean? And he who poured water on the ground has carried off the strong man in misery. All is in ruin. What do you mean, he who poured water on the ground? What sense does that make? Well, you go to the biblical story in Exodus 4, and we're told that Moses' first confrontation with Pharaoh, what does he do? God says, take some water from the Nile, pour it on dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. He who poured water on the ground has conquered the strong man. Can you think of another way to interpret that makes any sense? All right, we're going up against Putin. Who's got your glasses? We're going to go pour water. What sense does that make? Indeed, the hot-tempered man says, if I knew where God is, then I would serve him. What's the words of Pharaoh recorded in the Bible? Who is the Lord that I should obey or serve him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord. I will not let Israel go. Indeed, right pervades the land in name, but what men do in trusting to it is wrong. Indeed, the runners are fighting over the spoil of the robber. All his property is carried off. There's a great plunder. Indeed, the animals, their heart weep. The cattle moan. What's the fifth plague? Livestock. The cattle moan because of the state of the land. Indeed, the children of princes, not even royalty, is safe. They're dashed against walls. They die. The children of the neck. This is what that means. The children of the neck are laid out on high ground. Death has taken over the land. Indeed, gates, columns, and walls are burnt up like fire falling from the sky. Behold, the fire has gone up on high, and its burning goes forth against the enemies of the land. Behold, things have been done which have not happened for a long time past. The king has been deposed by the rabble. Indeed, that has perished which yesterday was seen, and the land is left over to what? Its weakness, like the cutting of flax. Get this. Indeed, the delta is in the hands of those who do not know it or own it. Like those who know it, the desert dwellers are skilled in the crafts of the delta. Foreigners. And this is his kind of prayer at the end. Oh, would that he, the long-lost Pharaoh, had perceived their nature in the first generation, which means they've been there many generations. Oh, if only we could go back to that first generation. Then he would have imposed obstacles. He would have stretched out his arm against them, and he would have destroyed their herds and their heritage. But now look at what's been done. What is Epiwar talking about at this perfect historical moment? Looking back at what has happened to his country, it's interesting. And so this is just fascinating to me, because when you understand what God is doing in the plagues, and that it matches perfectly the Egyptian cultural moment, this stuff is cool. You see, God comes along in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, and he doesn't just pour out plagues to say, I don't like you Egyptians. I'm going to be mean to you. You know what God is doing when he pours out the plagues? It's incredibly merciful. He is on a mission to tear down every single one of their gods that cannot save them, that only lead them into ruin. And so he declares, I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So let's walk through these plagues, right? And what's his mission statement? Why is he pouring out the plagues? So that I can punish my enemies? No. so that the Egyptians will know that I'm the Lord, that they will come to me, that they will leave Egypt with my people, which many of them do. This is evangelistic, believe it or not. How many of you came to faith when all of your idols started smashing down all around you? That's my story. And God is going to Egypt and he's saying, look at all these wicked idols. I'm going to smash them all. I'm going to show you that your gods cannot save, but I can. And so you start with the very first plague. The Nile turns to blood. You know what ancient Egyptians believed about the Nile? They believed that it was the bloodstream of Osiris, the green guy you see there. And Osiris was the god of the afterlife. He was the god of resurrection. And so when the contest goes out and you've got all the Hebrews that are saying, oh my goodness, God is coming to rescue us. And you've got all the Egyptians over here saying, our gods will never allow that. Pharaoh will never allow that. God says, okay, round one. And when the Nile turns to blood, guess what all the Egyptians are thinking? It's true. Oh my goodness, Osiris is coming to life. He's coming to fight for us. They've really made Osiris mad. And guess what happens days later? It all begins to rot. The blood begins to coagulate. Everything in the river begins to die. There's nothing that you can drink. And guess what all of Egypt has to think? Our God of the afterlife, our God of resurrection is dead. And all the water smells of death. You get to plague 2, right? The river smelled so bad, the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. You get to plague 2, and it's frogs. Oh no, not the frogs, right? Like, is there anyone else who thinks that's really weird? Like, if I'm going to punish my enemies, it's like, send them lizards, like, oh no. This is really, really important. And if you understand ancient Egyptian history, which the Lord does, you understand that that's their god Hecht, who has the head of a frog. And Hecht is their god of fertility, the god of new life in this world. So with the first plague, he goes to their god of the afterlife and says, dead. Next plague, he goes to the god of new life here, dead. And you know what happens? The frogs all die, and they make heaps of them all over the land, and now the land smells. So in this plague, all the water smells. This plague, all the land smells. This plague over here, you have nothing to drink. This plague over here, do you know how the Bible describes this plague? The Nile will teem with frogs, and they will come up into your palace, into your bedroom, and onto your bed. Why does it tell you that? Who is Hecht? Who's the frog god? The god of fertility. They're in your bedroom, on your bed. Hint, hint. Into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. In ancient Israel, do you know what the penalty was for killing a frog? Death. So if you've got an oven in the ground or kneading troughs that are filled with frogs, guess what you can't do? You can't cook. You can't eat. So in the first one, I can't drink. Second one, I can't eat. He's tearing down everything. So the frogs died in the houses and the courtyards and the fields. They're piled up into heaps and the land reeks. Everything is smelling. It's inescapable. You can't go inside and get away from it. So the third plague is lice, we believe. And so Geb is the Egyptians' god of the earth. It says that Moses comes and he strikes the earth and whoosh, lice are everywhere. And it prevents worship because in Egypt they had even tighter cleanliness laws than maybe even the Israelites. You had to be absolutely clean to be a priest. And now you're covered with lice and no worship can take place. God has shut down Egyptian worship with the third plague. He's taken on Geb, which is this dude there. You get to plague 4. And they're like, this is the finger of God. Now all of a sudden the Egyptians are worried. You get to plague 4, and he's going after Kepri. Dung beetles, flies, right? But it's probably dung beetles, and it's bugs in the idea is the Hebrew, bigger bugs. And so in Egypt, they believed that the sun rolled across the sky because the dung beetle god Kepri was behind the sun pushing it like a dung beetle pushes a roll of poo, right? Across the sky. And so now there's dung beetles everywhere, which, by the way, if you go and you look at scarabs that are all over Egypt, that's a scarab. That's Kepri, right? Kepri's waking up. Oh my goodness, he's coming to save us. Nope. Then you get to livestock. Think of all the Egyptian gods that take the form of livestock. And they just... But the Israelites' livestock is untouched. Now the Egyptians are going, our gods are getting whipped. Our gods are getting whipped. You get to the 6th plague, and it's boils. They're on the feet. You can't walk. All commerce shuts down. All worship shuts down. You can't do anything because everything hurts everyone. And all of their gods of healing, like Isis and Thoth and Sekhmet, like, they can't save us. And more gods. Plague 7. Fire and ice falling down. And you think the goddess of the sky, Nut, and Shu who holds it up, and Horus, and all these gods that are supposed to have control over the weather, did nothing to save the Egyptians. And you get to plague 8, and all the gods of crops, the gods of the Nile, the gods of abundance and agriculture. The locusts just come and say, nope. And so plague 9, you get to the last major god, Ra, the god of the sun. And God goes and says, and blots out the sun to where Egypt is in total darkness for 3 days. These plagues are lining up perfectly with all these ancient Egyptian customs. It's almost like they were written during the time period, right? Can you think of something that's pretty odd? How long does it go dark? 3 days. Their chief god is dead for 3 days. Their god of the afterlife, blood, right? The blood of the Nile that goes out. When you think of the plagues, think how wild it is that when God lays these down, He lays down these plagues that look like all these gods are being defeated, that they're getting this harsh judgment. And then Jesus comes along and He says, no, it'll be my blood that pours forth. I'll be the God who dies for 3 days for my people. And you get to the last plague, and it's the unthinkable one, where God comes along and says, I'm going to take the firstborn of every Egyptian who's behind a door that's not covered with the blood of an innocent lamb. And you think, how in the world could that possibly be? And God Himself will take this plague upon Himself. The one true God will see His firstborn son die. Why? So that His blood could be upon your houses and that you could find liberty leaving the land of death and slavery. Do you see the poetry that's going on 1,500 years before Jesus? The gospel is just being preached. He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And if His blood is upon you, you are spared. And so all of these plagues come along and just devastate Egypt. All right, now do these cities empty out? Is there a mass exodus? Well, let's look. This is Manfred Bittek, not a believer. He's the archaeologist from the University of Vienna. Let's read his report of Avaris. The archaeological material stops abruptly in the early 18th dynasty. Spot on. You mean they're not building anymore in Avaris? It's like, the town just goes dead all of a sudden? There are no scarabs of the 18th dynasty type in the stratum D2, the layer that he's digging. The most likely interpretation is that Avaris was abandoned. Hear that. This city, massive city, huge slave compound. I don't know what happened. It just was abandoned. There's no conflagration, which means burning, so it wasn't conquered by a foreign army. There's no layer of corpses or slain soldiers that have been found so far in the large and widely separated excavation areas. We don't know, and then get this, because he nails it perfectly. We don't know if the settlement continued beyond who? Beyond the time of Amenhotep II. Who's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? You remember our family tree? Amenhotep II. So all of a sudden you get to this layer and this massive, great city goes, whew. What do you do with that? That's pretty wild. So then you go to Pithom. Okay, that's Ramses, that's Avaris, that's that area. But what about Pithom? We know where that is, we believe now. Pithom is buried beneath modern-day Tel el-Rataba. And among the city's ruins, they found a temple to the sun god Atum. So Pi Atum, Pithom is where that comes from. In the International Journal for Egyptian Archaeology, researchers claim that the settlement was active during the 18th dynasty, citing most probably from the time of Thutmose III. That's Amenhotep's dad, the one that Moses fled from. So the city is big and active and there's tons of stuff going up. But right about that time period, within that time period, all of a sudden something weird happens. In the limited excavations that have been done so far, the team discovered a relatively large what? Silo. What were they commanded to do? They were enslaved to build what kind of cities? Storage cities. And so they find relatively large silo constructed of mud bricks. Well, that fits. They also found evidence of a larger group of people who lived in small huts with very thin walls, which means they're slave quarters. Their report added that the site was abandoned for unknown reasons. Between the reign of Thutmose III and Ramses II, you know who falls between those two? Amenhotep II, our Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's pretty cool. So they're going around the walls of this place at Tel el-Rataba, or Pithom, and they find that there's all these burial jars that contain the corpses of infants. And this really bothers the archaeologists because that does not happen in ancient Egyptian culture. If you went up into the land of the Canaanites, they sacrificed babies. You go to Moab or Ammon, they're sacrificing babies, but that's really unusual that in Egypt you find babies that are killed. We know of a story, right? We know of a story where Egyptians are killing babies. And so in an attempt to explain it, this is what Sir William Petrie wrote, because he can't believe that this is Egyptian. It just doesn't match up with the rest of Egyptians' history. This burial or child sacrifice was a custom in Syria, but such a custom has never been found among the Egyptians. We know of a time when that did happen, right? And gee, it's in Pithom. Interesting. Excavations have uncovered at least 6 burial jars near the wall of the city, and the jars have been dated to the 19th dynasty based on style, so that would be later. But you can see in the jar that's broken open, those are the bones of an infant. Wild, wild era in human history. And so then we have the problem when all the Israelites leave, they're leaving a slave city, and what does Pharaoh do? Moses goes to him and he's in grief. He's got his firstborn son who's died. And Pharaoh essentially says, "Get out of here. Leave." And then he has time to think about it and he says, "No." And so he tells his commander of the guard, "Get all the chariots. We're going after them. We're not letting them leave Egypt." And so select chariots. He took 600 of the best chariots, like 600 chariots in a slave city. Come on. Along with all the other chariots of Egypt, and he has quick access to them because he pursues them. He's not like, "Hold on a minute, let me travel several hundred miles to go down to Thebes to get my army so that I can chase you. It's way too far, they'd be gone." But you know what else they found right outside of Avaris? Catherine Bard, professor at Boston University, found the largest garrison of Egyptian stables and chariots at Cantir. Just 2 kilometers, less from here to the airport, like right there. From Avaris, dating to the 18th dynasty, right where we need them. And she wrote, "The first fully preserved stratum at Cantir contains remains of the first chariot garrison excavated in the Near East, including the evidence of foreigners, because it's Avaris. Some 400 artifacts were found which can be associated with chariots. It's the biggest find of its kind. There's nothing like it in the ancient world. You can see this is massive stone circles with the middles borne out so that you could tie your horses to these stones so they didn't run away. Tons of chariots there. Gee, that fits." And it tells us the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and there were with them 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And listen to this, many other people went up with them. So they take Africans with them. They're like, "You're part of Israel now." You're from Cush? Come on. You're Egyptian? Come on. Welcome. Worship the Lord with us. And they leave together. We know later on in Numbers, we're told that Moses' family gets upset with him. His sister and his brother began to talk against Moses because he married a Cushite wife. Very dark skin, would have been very racially different. God is not happy with them for opposing this. But Moses married a Cushite. You shall not, here's from Deuteronomy, you shall not detest an Egyptian because you were an alien in his land. And then he commands them, the sons of the third generation. Well, when would that be? The first generation's when you're coming out. Then they wander around for 40 years and they're about to go into the promised land. And all these sons that are coming into the promised land, everyone born there would have been of the third generation. And God is saying, the Egyptians that came with you out of Egypt have every right in my temple that you, Israel, do. Pretty phenomenal. They're grafted in. They've done DNA studies. We're coming to an end. We're close. They've done DNA studies from Harvard where they looked at 7 different Jewish populations. And you know what they find? It's really fascinating that every one of the populations contains between 3 and 5% of African DNA sequence patterns that date back on average more than 100 generations. In their report, the researchers concluded, remember the guy, the Israelites were never in Africa. They were never in Egypt. The Jewish groups descend from a common ancestral population which was itself admixed with Africans. DNA proves it. They were there. Prior to the beginning of the exile where they scattered all over the world, prior to that moment, they were intermingling and interbreeding with Egyptians, with Africans. And so this is one of the palaces, because Amenhotep and Thutmose III rebuilt an even grander palace than Thutmose I, right on the Nile. And in that palace, they found that they had trade relationships with Greece. It's one of their favorite findings. They get all excited about it. And you can see, and we talked about this when we talked about the ruins of Sodom. Remember the bull leaping? They were all excited about bull leaping. That was the big sport way back then. Well, in Tel el-Rataba, or Avaris, in the palace of Pharaoh, they found this fresco that you're looking at right here on the wall. And so they know that they had trading relationships with Crete. They know that they had trading relationships with Greece, Mycenae, the ancient populations. Why am I telling you this? Because when you go to Mycenae, you find these ancient grave circles. And in the grave circles, the people who were being buried in these grave circles would say, we've got all this stuff that's coming from Egypt, and I'm going to be buried with my treasures. And so bring in all of these artifacts that came from Egypt. I want to be buried. And they would be buried in this grave circle that you see. You see in this grave circle inscriptions that come from Amenhotep II. You remember who that is? That's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So his stuff is in there. Amenhotep III was in there. A scarab of Queen Tai, who's all in that family, are all in the grave circle. And then they come 50 meters or 60 meters away from where they find all the stuff that belongs to the pharaohs, and they find some pretty incredible reliefs. We're going to close with these. There's 3 stones. The first stone looks like this. And you can see it's old, and so it's worn, but you can see all these swirly marks in ancient artwork, Egyptian, even Mediterranean. That represents water. That represents water. And so water, water, and in between you see a guy who's on a chariot. We know that's a metal chariot because of the way that it's just got the 4 spokes. He's in a chariot, there's his horse, and he's confronting a guy who's facing toward him, and he's holding a big long stick. Okay, well that could be war. Maybe they're going at it and the guy's holding his javelin and he wants to kill him. Maybe that could be it, and they're doing it maybe between 2 lakes or something. I don't know. But you get to the next one and it gets a little harder to explain. Now you have water. Water, the chariot's racing to catch up with the guy who's holding the staff, but what do you notice? The water is intruding. The water is collapsing between the man holding the big stick and the guy in the chariot chasing him. And the last one of these stones, this is really frustrating by the way, was mined for the limestone that was in the middle of it. But you get an idea. Here you see that man holding the big stick. But you see the horse, it's going backward. Its rider is being tossed. All of this is absolute chaos, and everything on this side is in pandemonium. What's that sound like? Sounds a lot like the crossing of the Red Sea. And when does it date to? Within a century of when we should find it. What's it next to? All these inscriptions and scarabs of the Pharaoh that we believe is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So again, you put together the history of Israel, the history of Egypt, and you can plug Moses into it, and it matches up so perfectly. And what does that mean? Because the Exodus from Egypt is, of all the salvation stories, of all the redemption stories that we find in the Bible, it is the most similar. It's what the New Testament will say that Jesus is for us, the Passover lamb, the lamb without blemish who is going to be slain, and his blood spares us. Jesus is going to be a greater Moses. Moses comes out and he'll give the law on a mountain. Jesus will preach on the mountain. Moses will divide up the land among the 12 tribes. Jesus will have the 12 apostles. Moses is going to be through the Red Sea. Jesus will go through the Jordan. Both of them are compared to baptisms. Both of them are going to lead the people out of the land of death and bondage. Both of them are going to defeat the kings marked by the serpent. Do you hear how God is ordaining this history? And you can just see him singing about a greater story that's yet to come. It's like the history is prophetic about what's to come. And how does he save us? He goes into our lives and begins smashing all of our idols, all those things that we worship, all those things that we hold as more precious to God. It is loving. It is tremendously merciful for God to smash your idols. And if he's shaking up your idols right now, thank him. He's so much more precious. If he's shaking up your idols, grab hold of him. He's a treasure. Far greater than they are. He offers a security far greater than they do. He gives an inheritance that's imperishable. Can't be taken away. It's infinite in nature. You can't lose it because you didn't earn it. It was a gift that Almighty God came down into this world and said, I'm going to accomplish your exodus for you. Come with me. Follow me. I love looking at all these stories, and I say this every time, and I'm going to say it every time until we're done. If you walk away with this just being an academic exercise, that's nice. I want you to walk away from tonight looking at all this stuff going, he's real. He does these things. He rescues his people. When the slaves and those that are mistreated and those who are oppressed cry out to him, he delivers. We see it. And as we go further in the next few sessions, you see it again and again and again. Press him. You got doubts? Press into him. You're a skeptic? Try him. He holds up. His promises are true. His word is reliable. We have great reason to put our whole confidence in this God. He's good. Let me pray for us. Father, Lord, I thank you so much for this stuff. It is so encouraging to think about all this, to look and to read those reports where these slave cities that were built as storage cities and all these people that your word says were crying out to you. And your word says you heard them and that you came and delivered them. Lord, when we read those words that these slave cities just emptied out, how cool is that? You did that. You delivered them. And how much more do you love us that you don't just slaughter a lamb and put it on doorposts, but you give your son with a far more precious blood to defeat sin, to defeat death, to free us from the slaveries of this world. Lord, I pray that after tonight we would just see you as a God who's real. You're a God who's there. You're a God who hears us. And I pray that you would be a God who delivers us ultimately into eternal life, but even now from that which enslaves us. We pray all this in Christ's name. Everybody said, amen. All right, God bless. Have a good night. Any questions?